Sam, for Thank you, Sam, for that gracious introduction. Welcome to everyone again, and I think we'll have a lot to discuss about this film. And what I wanted to do to start us off, I put together a few slides to go over a few points that I wanted to re-emphasize from the film and pull out a little bit. Hello to everyone. And then after, we're gonna open it up for Q&A and hopefully get a good discussion going, because I think there's so much richness that we can pull out of this film, and it has larger implications for how we think about what Blackness is and how we study Africa and the African diaspora, especially as people of African descent, for instance. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see my slides here. And okay, Sam, am I good with the one slide? All right. Okay, so my short presentation, and believe me, it won't be that long. I won't go on for an hour or anything. We want to make sure we have time to talk. Is reflections on Herskovits at the Heart of Blackness, which is the name of the film itself. What I wanted to do to kind of start the conversation is to talk about where I'm coming from as a viewer of the film, but as someone who also has to and had to engage with the work of Melville Herskovits. First and foremost, I'm coming to this as a Black woman who is very much interested in the cultures of Africa and the African diaspora. Secondly, as an academic who was trained in cultural anthropology at the University of Michigan, and having to, as a part of that process, directly engage with Herskovits's work. So I had to read, for example, The Myth of the Negro Past for my comprehensive exams for my PhD, right? Thank you. Thanks, Sam. And so having to engage with that and some of his other work, because if you are doing any kind of research on cultural development in the Americas, it's almost a given that you have to engage with Herskovits and talk about Africanisms and talk about the larger discussion around cultural development in the Americas from different perspectives. So it's become, his myth of the Negro past has become a part of the anthropological canon, not just within anthropology, but it's also become a part of the canon in larger African diaspora studies as well. So this particular work of Herskovits definitely has a larger impact. And I think especially as we see and learn more about what was going on behind the scenes in terms of some of his personal politics and things that he chose to do, it helps us to start thinking about and questioning where some of this knowledge comes from. So this leads me to the title of kind of the larger theme for talking about the documentary, which is the politics of knowledge production. And what I'm using to set that up is that last question that Dr. Janetta B. Cole posed to us as an audience at the end of the documentary. Who has access to understanding, to explaining a people, and to what use, right? So who is it that has the power to define who we are as a people, to explain who we are as a people to others, and to exclude you, me, and others from being able to produce that knowledge. And so I think that the politics of knowledge production helps us to get at the racial politics, which the documentary definitely discussed in terms of the exclusion of Black scholars. The national politics, this is reflected in the growing Title VI area in terms of funding of the US government for African studies, area studies programs. But even before that, foundations like the Carnegie Foundation and the Ford Foundation that were directly implicated in funding these programs, including Northwestern's program that Melville Herskovits started in 1948. So these particular foundations who provided funding for African studies, but did not necessarily want to give that money to Black scholars, right? So those kinds of politics as well. That's the Cold War politics that are a part of that. Colonial politics as well, because there were also ways that African studies itself was embedded in responding to, and not necessarily in a good way, responding to what was happening in Africa in the 30s, 40s, 50s, especially in the 60s, as African former colonies were demanding their independence, right? And so there was some buddy-buddy relationships between African studies programs that were developed at majority white institutions that were working with, for example, white South African scholars as well, and not in a way that was looking to dismantle apartheid or dismantle this kind of racial regime. So these politics that, for instance, Herskovits seemed to, told his students to avoid were actually completely embedded in a lot of the things that he did. Even though he may not have seen it that way, they were a politics regardless. So a few quick points, things that I wanted to discuss: the question of identity and the question of objectivity, pseudoscientific racism, the contributions of Herskovits' work in terms of Africanisms in particular, and then dealing with white privilege, access, and influence. So the first is identity and the question of objectivity. And so with this, the film gets us to really think about, forces us to think about the importance of people's experiences and their own personal identities for even shaping the kinds of questions that they ask. So the film spends quite a bit of time talking about Melville Herskovits as the son of Jewish immigrants to the United States, who was trying to kind of figure out his place in the world. The film tells us about some of the anti-Semitism that he himself faced, but also reveals to us the ways in which he used his own power to exclude Black scholars from advancing in African studies. So this question of identity is useful for thinking about the kinds of questions we ask when we conduct research, and this points us towards thinking about objectivity. And what I want you to ponder is, objectivity is supposed to be an approach that's without bias. But as I think a lot of what we saw in the documentary reveals, is anyone without bias. Every single one of us, you know, are shaped by our experiences and by a particular set of perspectives that develop over the course of our lifetime. And so we all come to the table with particular ideas and preconceived notions. So whether you're doing biology or you're doing anthropology, you're bringing ideas with you. And so I think, at least I know within anthropology and a number of other disciplines, people do realize and recognize now that true objectivity does not exist. That it's impossible to be completely objective. We all come in with particular ideas in mind. So the better practice that many anthropologists do now is to recognize your positionality. Where are you coming from? And therefore that helps readers, who are reading your work, to better understand where you're situated and how people saw you. And that helps readers to really digest and understand what kind of research you were able to do, right? So if you're a white man studying, you know, the religious practices of a women's group in Benin, how much could you really learn about what they're doing? How do they react to you? How are they interacting with you? So putting that information in there is really, really key for anyone to be able to assess the kind of work that you did. And it's key to the kind of research that you're able to do, period. And the other thing I'll mention about this question of objectivity is that Herskovits really weaponized it in using it against Black scholars by saying that because they were Black, because they were of African descent, they were too close to the material and could not be objective. And so he was able to use that kind of argument about them lacking objectivity, about saying that they were activists instead of being scholars, in order to undermine much of the work that his contemporary Black scholars were doing. So scholars who were there at the time. And in this sense, we can see Herskovits as a kind of gatekeeper. So for instance, there's an article I pulled this from where he boasted to another scholar, a historian, that he was the hatchet man, literally called himself the hatchet man, who made sure the Carnegie Foundation would not fund Du Bois's Encyclopedia Africana, right? So while, and you saw this, they mentioned this in the documentary, that he was already undermining it, but he clearly recognized himself in that role and was boasting about it. And in addition to that, it wasn't just Du Bois. There were other incidents in which there were funding applications that Herskovits was involved in, where he undermined the Black scholars who were putting in those applications as well. The second thing I wanted to talk about briefly is this issue of pseudoscientific racism. So this is what Herskovits was working against as an anthropologist and with his research that he was doing on cultural behaviors and traits that you could find in the Americas that are traceable to an African origin. And so I just wanted to kind of lay this out so that, because at the same time that we're pointing out many of the faults of Melville Herskovits, we also are recognizing the contributions that he did make at the same time. And so the larger kind of academic and moment in the scholarship in the late 19th century, early 20th century was really about scholars, and in particular anthropologists, trying to classify people into different races. And this was within the context of, don't forget, European colonization of Africa and Asia and other parts of the world, and also a rise in European immigrants coming to the United States from many different parts of Europe. And so this classification of people into races definitely had a political component to it. So one, what he was working against was this idea of race, in which it's based on these traits, these phenotypical traits. So largely people understand now that race as a concept is discredited. In biology, we don't actually have separate human races, right? We just have one human race. But back then, they classified people based on visible traits, skin color, for example, and use this to classify people into different races. And when I say they, I mean academic scholars and especially anthropologists. This is what they were doing. And these were overly simplistic classification systems that were really aligned with the political use of race during the colonial period, which was used to justify keeping Europeans separate from all of these colonial subjects, right? Justify, if you're able to say that these people are not as smart as we are, these people don't have the same kind of cultural values, then as the documentary pointed out, it enables you to justify treating groups of people in ways that are very, very harsh and very unfair, right? So if you believe that people are not people, for example, if you say that they're on this larger hierarchy and they're at the bottom closer to animals, then you can justify killing them. You can justify taking their land. You can justify forcing them into forced labor and saying that, well, by forcing them to do this work, we're teaching them how to work, right? So there's all of these ideas that were tied up with this imperial project, white supremacy, and a whole host of other things that weren't just centered here in the United States, but were global in nature. So this is an example of from the book called The Mismeasure of Man. This is a book by a physical anthropologist named Stephen Jay Gould. And it's actually a really good read. He goes through the ways that anthropologists contributed to this pseudoscientific racism, this fake science that was used to justify treating people of color in ways that made them subhuman. They're basically saying they were subhuman, they were not equal to Europeans, and thus could be colonial subjects, thus could be subjugated under European control. So this is one example of a drawing that that was done during this time period, where you see at the top you have the Greeks, then you have Negro in the middle, right above a chimpanzee, right? And so there were these kinds of classificatory systems that anthropologists would come up with, where they would rank people, and Black people almost always were at the bottom. And so this was used to, again, justify mistreating people and used to justify the colonial enterprise as well, justifying segregation, everything else. So what I wanted to do to kind of break this up, instead of me just talking, I'm going to show you all a quote about a group of people, and it's a group of natives. They're called natives. And I want you to try and guess what group of natives this quote is about. And I want you to throw it in the chat, your guesses. Here's the quotation. "But I'm haunted by the human chimpanzees I saw along that horrible the 100 miles of horrible country. I don't believe they are our fault. I believe that there are not many more of them than of old, but that they're happier, better, more comfortably fed and lodged under our rule than they ever were." So what group of natives do you think this quote is referring to? Don't think about it too much. Just throw it in the chat. I see Africans. Other guesses? Enslaved Africans? Others? Africans in Americas? Natives? I see Anglo-Saxon. Native Americans? Barbarians, said by the Greeks, okay. Africans in colonial Africa, Irish, others, East Indians. Okay, we got a number, Moors, got a number of good guesses. So let's see what it is. The group actually being described, someone did get it, is the Irish, right? And so this is just, I use this as an example to show how over time, groups with power have used racial ideology intentionally to create difference and to justify the oppression of other groups. So the group that was writing this description was actually the British, right? And so they were using it to justify invading Ireland. So understanding, again, this creation of difference is a political strategy. And it has not only been used against Africans, but it's been used across the world, right? And so this is some of what Melville Herskovits with his work was trying to actually work against. So trying to undermine these ideas of racial difference and trying to point towards the humanity of people of African descent. So this leads to some of his contributions. So one of the areas that we talk about Melville Herskovits in terms of his contributions, as I mentioned, is in terms of cultural development. So if you're talking about cultural development in the Americas for people of African descent, what I put up here are several images that are more so centered. Some of them are more so specific to the United States, but I have the first image on the upper left-hand side is an image of stepping, right? So as a particular set of cultural practice that you find amongst Black fraternities and sororities in the United States, but that's not the only place you find this kind of percussive body musicking. This goes all the way back to patting juba during the era of enslavement. And even before that, you can find many examples of this kind of making music with your body in different parts of Africa. So it's just one among many examples of how you have cultures that come to define what's a part of the African-American experience that have different kinds of origins. In the upper top right, I have an image of cornrows, which we know goes way back into ancient Africa. And for those of you who know how to cornrow, I'd ask you, who taught you how to cornrow? And so how some of this knowledge is passed on from person to person. The bottom left image is showing a service in a church, in an African-American church. And here I'm pointing out not just the embodiment, but also the call and response. So for example, let the church say amen. Everyone responds, amen. You find corollaries in hip hop. All the ladies in the house say, ah, ah, right? So the call and response itself, that is a part of African-American culture, but you also find throughout cultures throughout the African diaspora and within Africa itself, of course. And then here's the last one on the bottom left. This is an image of baked macaroni and cheese. Anyone have any idea where that comes from and how that became embedded in African-American culture in the US? No responses? So as far as folks have been able to find out in terms of the food history of it, someone wrote, someone who was enslaved, yes. So yes, this was actually brought to, as far as we know, brought to the US and popularized by an enslaved Black chef named James Hemings, who was the enslaved chef of Thomas Jefferson, right? And related to Sally Hemings, right? So he learned about baked macaroni and cheese while he was in France, where it was popular, and put his own spin on it and brought it back to the US. So thank you, James Hemings, because I love baked mac and cheese. Okay, so these are all examples of cultural development, but how do we discuss how cultures come to be for people of African descent? And so this is one of the larger questions that Melville Herskovits contributed to with his work with the myth of the Negro past, and in particular, the concept of Africanisms. And so what I'm pointing us towards now is that particular contribution, and then the debate and engagement of Herskovits with Black scholars like E. Franklin Frazer. So when it came to discussing cultural development, this Herskovits-Frazer debate is one of the things that, as someone who's learning about cultural development, one of the first things you learn to discuss and engage with in terms of how each of them as scholars talked about the development of cultures amongst African Americans and other people of African descent in the Americas. So for Herskovits, he came up with this concept of Africanisms, which were basically cultural traits or practices in the Americas that can be traced to an African origin, right? So elements of culture that can be traced to an African origin. And he basically, with the book, The Myth of the Negro Past, what, as the documentary pointed out, he really was trying to work against was this common assumption that Black people in the United States had no culture and had no history. And so with this particular work, he is making connections between people of African descent throughout the Americas and to similar kinds of practices in different parts of Africa, right? So, and making, basically undercutting and completely rejecting this assumption that Black people in the Americas don't have a culture. And for people who don't learn as much about their own histories and cultures in the classroom, for instance, K-12 education in this country does not center the Black experience for the most part. And so I think for as they pointed out, for many African Americans, this became, and even outside of the US, this particular work became kind of a key volume to have to talk about what it meant to have an African culture in the Americas. And so he argued against these assumptions that slavery or the Middle Passage were so bad that they completely stripped people of their cultural heritage, and said instead that African Americans and others have these unique connections to Africa. Now, who was he in conversation with? E. Franklin Frazer was a sociologist who was mentioned as a part of this documentary as well. Like many other Black scholars at the time, he is teaching at HBCUs because you have to remember, this is during the era of segregation, right? And so even though he was also very well educated, PhD from the University of Chicago, he was not getting hired by any white institutions, right? And so, but E. Franklin Frazer was very concerned about the larger implications of saying that Black people had these African kinds of traits. And so in his work, for example, the Negro family in the United States, the Negro church also, he talked about African-American culture being mostly shaped by what happened on the American side, what happened, the Middle Passage being really traumatic and ridding people of some of these cultural traits, and then slavery itself being really traumatic. And then also talking about the contemporary conditions that people were living in, being what's shaping their cultural practices. And as the documentary pointed out, E. Franklin Frazer and other scholars and other Black people in general were very concerned that being able to point to or focus on an African origin for cultural practices would in fact then lead to increased discrimination against Black Americans, because then they would be seen as even more different from white Americans. And so then this could be used to justify continuing segregation. And the last part of what I wanted to bring to your attention in terms of recapping the documentary is the importance of white privilege, access, and influence. And so these are some of the unsettling kinds of things that the documentary points out to us about Melville Herskovits and his interactions with funders, with Black scholars, and with others. So who controls funding, access, and resource allocation? So they talk about, again, the Carnegie Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Department of Education, Department of Defense, all within the US government, making these decisions about who to fund based on whether or not they saw people as being radical, whether they saw people as having larger goals, for example, trying to get social equality for Black Americans. So, and then providing the funds to programs and to scholars who they saw as not pushing a social agenda, right? So then what does African studies mean when African studies is not tied to Black liberation? And so that is kind of what's happening. It's really what was happening with a lot of these kinds of funding decisions. The other thing that the documentary pointed us towards and showed us was that Melville Herskovits was completely embedded in this. So as I mentioned, he blocked Du Bois on Encyclopedia Africana, but he also blocked other scholars. I believe he wrote against E. Franklin Frazer as well, when E. Franklin Frazer was trying to get funding for Howard to fund their African studies program. And all of this are actually these letters are in the archives. There are several archives that have letters from Herskovits and also the deliberations of the committees for these foundations. So you see how many of these decisions were really about controlling who would have access to these funds and making sure that it wasn't an influential Black scholar who could use it to advocate for liberation or for other kinds of things. Uneasy relationships with Black scholars. This is about, again, Herskovits being someone who, as Janetta Cole talked about, seemed to act like he owned Africa, right? But did not want to give control or share control with a single Black scholar. That he wanted to be the one who was the gatekeeper, who said who can access what and when, and didn't want to have to share that with anyone else. And so I'm bringing this to our attention because it's not as if these kinds of conditions have completely changed. Even now, when people are looking for funding for programs, we have to go to foundations. We have to go to the US government and so on to get these large pockets of money to get programs off the ground. And so you can see the ways in which Black scholars, if you are seen as being a problem, if you're trying to push for too much too fast, would be excluded from these resources. So at the same time that Herskovits established this great program, which they call the first African studies program in the US, but there are other articles pointing out that there actually was a program at Fisk before. There was a program at Northwestern. But anyways, these resources, these hundreds of thousands of dollars that he collected over decades that helped to build up that program were also tied in with his politics. So as much as he pointed out or told his students not to be involved in politics, all of his decisions were completely embedded in his own personal politics as well about whether or not Black scholars should be allowed access to these resources. So I'll leave us with these two questions. What does all of this mean for studying Africa and the African diaspora? And who gets to define what Blackness is? So with the first one, I hope I can point us towards decolonizing knowledge production. So thinking about who has the means and the resources to create knowledge. Who is creating this knowledge? And are we looking at the creator of the knowledge as well, right? Are we trying to include scholars who have been excluded? Are we trying to include scholars of African descent? Are we trying to include continental Africans? Are we trying to include many others? Are we collaborating with people and pulling them into the fold? Also, how can we remain aware of these power dynamics? Power dynamics, not just at the level of funding, but also at interpersonal levels as well, when you have someone with such power as Herskovits, only having something like 2 or 3 Black students over his entire career in terms of who he mentored. So why is it that you have so much emphasis and so many resources going towards white scholars, and he's not putting in the work to really bring up these Black scholars, right? And so these power dynamics about who has access to the resources, who's able to allocate them, and then who's able to define what you're able to do, right? So in the situation where you're getting your PhD, your advisor has a lot of control over what you can do. And so these power dynamics on multiple levels are really important for understanding how we study Blackness and who gets to define it. The third thing I'd mention is beware of those who will cause you to doubt your own contributions, right? So as Dr. Cole points out in the documentary, Herskovits was very much interested in controlling the knowledge production and making sure that he was the one who benefited and got to kind of set the standard, everything else, and didn't want anyone usurping his power. And so beware of those who would have you doubt yourself. And so I'm saying this for people of African descent who are in programs, who are doing research and have scholars who don't come from their community doubting the work that you're doing. So beware of those who would doubt what you bring to the table, because sometimes that doubt is very intentional to cause you, to throw you off your game. And lastly, I think the last thing I wanted to end on was the importance of self-definition. What does it mean for people of African descent to define Blackness for themselves? What does it mean for people of African descent to define how they're going to study Africa and the African diaspora, write about themselves, write about others, but on their own terms? And so I think that leaving us on that point of self-definition is really, really key in terms of thinking about what is the future for Africana studies and for the study of Africa and the African diaspora more generally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Covington Ward. I noticed that we do have a question in the Q&A from Kevin Mosley, and he asks, can you discuss the depth that eugenics held sway over so many scholars during Herskovits and Du Bois's time?
Thank you, Mr. Mosley, for that question. It's a very good question. And this was eugenics as a kind of supposed science that was supposed to be about ridding the population of these inferior elements. So it's intentional kind of breeding to move in a particular direction, was also tied in with the pseudoscientific racism, and really came to afore with the large numbers of European immigrants that were coming into the United States in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So what they were doing in terms of trying to classify these groups is creating, these anthropologists would create, not 5 races. They would have like 60 races, right? And try to classify people based on where they came from, try to make larger kinds of assumptions or just generalizations about head shape, nose shape, all kinds of things in order to define all of these different groups of people. But it wasn't just defining in order to define for itself. Whenever we categorize anything, the categories really don't mean anything. It's really about the meaning that we assign those categories, right? So when you have, for example, the colors white and black, they're just colors. But it's about how in our particular country and world, right, how whiteness and blackness have been defined as concepts that adds this particular meaning to them. And so it was the same thing with the categorization of these different races. They were done in such a way to put Western Europeans at the top, and they would actually then categorize Europeans that were coming from Eastern Europe, Southern Europeans like Italians, and Portuguese. They were particularly, especially the Italians, they were very, very wary of. They said they were too swarthy, they were a little too brown, right? And then it goes on down. And inevitably, what you had at the bottom was Africans and people of African descent, at the very bottom, right above animals. So this is completely tied in with the larger national concern about what to do with this overwhelming number of immigrants that were coming in that many people saw as an attack on their American life and their American way of being, right? These Europeans, immigrants who spoke other languages, other immigrants coming from other places who did not dress as Americans at the time dress, had different religious beliefs, and so on. So the nation was very concerned about them bringing in not just their cultures, but also their biology, and then in some way diluting this American blood and bringing the nation down, right? So eugenics itself was tied in with this kind of ethno-nationalism that was really about trying to limit immigration and trying to control the types of immigrants that were coming to the country.
Okay, thank you. I don't actually see, let me check the chat. Okay, there's something from Patricia. It says, it seems to me that you gave examples of how power corrupts and that one needs a regular source of humility to be teachable and open to different views for the closest to truth as possible. It's more of a statement. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan, Ms. or Mrs. Sullivan. I'm sorry, I don't know. But I really appreciate that because you are pointing out something that is key because power does corrupt and people use different types of ideologies in order to further their own ends, right? So whether we are talking about the kind of racial ideology that was used to that led to, for example, the extermination of millions of Jews and others during the Holocaust, or the racial ideology that was used during the Rwandan genocide that led to the extermination to an estimated million people, right? Again, the same kinds of tactics are at work in terms of creating this idea of difference, using it to separate a group from, make an out group, right? And then an in group, and then demonizing the out group so much that they're no longer seen as human, because then that allows you to treat them in a way that you would never treat you and your own.
Okay, I did have a list of questions, but your presentation just really went through them all. So you've already addressed what I wanted to say, but it's something I did want to get to, which I think is very important, that was mentioned in the film, and then also mentioned by yourself. And that is the degree of racism that prevented scholars access to the archives, access to the evidence of human endeavor. You know, I don't want to, well, I will pick on museums and archives because I'm in that profession, so I feel comfortable. There are stories, you know, going through my nearly 30 years of scholars who I have met, whose work I met before I actually met them. But when I met them, one of the first things they told me was their stories of being prevented access to archives, and that they had to get like a white person, a white professor, to sort of carry them or vouch for them in order to get access to the archives. And these were primarily stories that took place in the 70s and 80s, that happened to them in the 70s and 80s and were told to me in the 90s and 2000s. And, you know, I wasn't surprised because I work in the profession and I know the racial attitudes that exist. And it really does, you know, on one hand, where you're talking about access to the documentation, the other, in Herskovits' point, what maybe you can explain a little bit more about the role of the State Department in scholars' foreign travel for research, and how that plays out. And so when you have someone like the gatekeeper, like Herskovits, who could basically eliminate any Black scholar from going to Africa, or getting access to material in an archive or something like that. He wasn't very collegial when it came to his relationship with Black scholars. But can you address that a little bit about this, the lack of access then and now?
Sam, thank you so much. It's actually a great question, and I think it really points to the power of archives as a site of power as well, right? Because archives themselves are not, as you well know, not these neutral entities but are based on a whole number of power dynamics, not just about the collection and what was seen as valuable enough to put in an archive, but also then who can access it, right? And I think this definitely, I think, was more of an issue in the past. I don't think it's completely gone though. But you can think about how hard it would be as a Black scholar in the 40s and 50s who wants to write about a particular topic, and you go to an archive in the South and you're denied access, right, to those materials, but your white, someone you know who's a white scholar is able to access them with no problem. So it's I think another level and layer of this, of the power dynamics that are related to knowledge production, right? Because then if you're excluded from that knowledge, then you can never be completely sure about where you stand in terms of the material that you're presenting, right? Because you could present something and then you can have a scholar say, well, you didn't use such and such an archive, and your points are not valid because you didn't consider this that's in the archive. Well, I can't access that, right? And I remember when I went to do archival research in Belgium, there's an archive that they call the African Archive that has all of Belgium's, most of Belgium's records dealing with their African colonies, which included what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. And I remember I have a Congolese member of my committee and mentor who said to me, watch how they treat you. When you go there, you'll see that sometimes they won't even let you in. And this was based on his experience that he had as a Congolese researcher trying to go and do this work. And interestingly enough, I didn't have that issue because I was an American. So when I explained to him what happened and how they opened up most stuff to me and didn't give me any problems, he said, yeah, that's not how they treat Congolese, right? So even though I'm Black, like he was, they definitely saw me as different because I wasn't Congolese. And so I think it's really important, again, for understanding your positionality and how it impacts the research that you're able to do. So I don't think those issues are completely gone. I think that they're still there, especially when they're subjective, right? If there's something you want to see and it's up to the archivist to decide whether or not they want to make time for you that day, right? They might say, well, I'm done for the day and I don't have the time to go and get that document for you. And knowing that you're leaving, the next day, right? So I think that those kinds of subjective gray areas are the places where some of those biases can still play out. And I think that will definitely limit the kind of work that Black scholars can do. The second thing about the State Department, so Herskovits, he actually, got most of his funding from foundations. He didn't get, he got some of the Title VI funding later, but he didn't have as much influence with the State Department because they were more wary of him. As they mentioned in the documentary, he was being considered for like a head position for the Bureau of African Affairs. And then they saw that he was a member or involved in too many organizations that they saw as kind of leftist. And so they didn't continue considering him for the position. But many of these early African studies programs were led by people who were formerly within the State Department or formerly within the precursor of the CIA, right? So the funding for African studies was completely tied up in these Cold War politics and other kinds of national governmental politics and international politics that were not necessarily for the benefit of Africans, right? It was more so the US looking out for of course, its country and being able to understand what's going on in Africa in order to be able to better control it or better impact what's going on. And so that has not changed that much, to be honest. So when you apply for different kinds of funding, even now, if you have a project that is more tied towards, they actually have these priority points. So if you are doing a language that's tied to an area where the US is currently has some interest. So for example, if you're doing something involved with Afghanistan, when we were there during the war, your project gets bumped up, for funding, you know what I mean? So all of that is definitely tied into the government's politics in terms of what they see as a priority. And so that has not gone away, that is still there.
Okay, we have a few more questions that have come in. One's asked from Dogma. Did scholars like Dr. Franklin Frazer buy into the quote unquote Tarzan myth? And did that cause a psychological strain in the relationship between Africans on the continent and Africans in the diaspora?
So Dogma, thank you so much for that question. And I have to say, I am not sure about E. Franklin Frazer's personal ideas about Africa. I have not gone in and researched that in particular. What I will say is, like, there were others within the Black community, even to this day, even now, there are still Black Americans who don't want to associate themselves with Africa and Africans, right? Because of these larger negative preconceptions about Africa as a continent, about Africans in general, associations with poverty, associations with violence, associations with, oh, nothing positive comes out of Africa, Africa is underdeveloped and backwards, all of these kinds of ideas that are really fostered by the media, fostered by our lack of a comprehensive education about African history and contemporary Africa. So not just Africa in the past, but Africa now. How did we get there? So people moving, I think, from a place of lack of knowledge often don't want to associate themselves with Africa. Now, I'm not sure if that was what E. Franklin Frazer's particular motive was. He did lead the African Studies program at Howard for some time, right? So I believe that he must have seen some kind of value in what he was doing. However, if you look at the applications he put in, he definitely focused on emphasizing that he was a neutral party, that he was not biased, that he was objective, and using that kind of language in order to, I guess, anticipate some of the funders not wanting to give him money because of this assumption that Black Americans would be emotional or biased in certain ways towards doing research in Africa. And so I think that his is a bit more complex as well. So I'm not sure about his personal ideas about Africa, but we do know, and even to this day, have African Americans who have these kind of negative perceptions of Africa that still persist. So I'm not sure if he did or not. Also, there was a question about a touring exhibit that someone added into the chat called Deadly Medicine that dealt with eugenics. Thank you for sharing that. Eugenics is, as a movement, had an impact on a large number of people. There were people who were forcibly sterilized due to these eugenics theories. So for example, and this is not just like in the past, there were a group of people in North Carolina, including many Black women who had been forcibly sterilized. Fannie Lou Hamer also went through this, where whatever the justification was, you came in for some other kind of procedure and they would decide to take away your ability to reproduce because you were seen as being a burden on society as a Black woman or a poor woman of whatever race, as opposed to someone who would contribute. So this happened across the country. This happened not just in North Carolina, it happened in California, it happened in states across the entire country. And I mentioned North Carolina because they just paid some kind of reparations to some of those victims who were forcibly sterilized, often without their knowledge or consent. So eugenics was not just a theory, it was actually enacted through policy across most of the states in this country. Oh, Sam, we can't hear you.
Okay, thank you. Vernice asked, would you say that colonialism in areas such as India, Asia, Italy, and she has the Moors in parentheses, I'm not sure what that connection is, people of melanated hues carries over even in these cultures?
Absolutely. There are many people who write about neocolonialism, these new kind of ways that colonialism continues to perpetuate, and people who argue that are we really in a post-colonial time, or does colonialism continue in different ways, right? But whether you're talking about India, whether you're talking about Zimbabwe, whether any places where you have people who have been colonized, you still have some kind of remains, vestiges, many ways that you still see this. I'll give you a couple quick examples. Colorism is one. So in many of these places, for example, skin bleaching is something you find throughout many of these cultures that experience European colonization. And so in India is one of the top places for skin bleaching in the world. And then also other different parts of Asia, Nigeria has a lot of skin bleaching, the Congo, all throughout Africa. I remember when I was doing research in the Democratic Republic of Congo saying to myself, these people need a Black Power movement. Please get rid of these skin bleaching creams. But they're all over the place. If you go to an African store, even now, right here in Pittsburgh, you will find skin bleaching products in the front, right? So these ways that colonialism persists in how people think about themselves continues to this very day. So even though the governments have changed, even though the people who supposedly in power have changed, people who are outside of that country are still making the rules about, for example, the value of the products that people are growing, right? They're not the ones setting the international monetary value of cocoa or of palm, palm oil and so on. They're not the ones making those decisions. Our global economy is still one shaped by white supremacy. And so you still have the many ways that colonialism continues and impacts people and in ways that they can see and often that they cannot see as well. Oh, Sam, we need you to unmute.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Jenny asked, could you please comment more on Herskovits' relationship with and views on Black scholars compared to his relationship and views on white scholars and scholars of other groups?
Yeah, it's I think the way that I can comment on this is to think about and talk about Herskovits' role in founding the African Studies Association, right? So the ASA is the African Studies Association. He was involved in founding it and became its first president. And this African Studies Association from the beginning was set up, actually the first meetings that led to it being founded were actually arranged through a funder, one of these foundations that was calling together people who were researching Africa to talk about trying to create something. And all of these people were white. All of these people who were involved in this were white, right? And so from the beginning, you had this, the way in which the organization itself was arranged was one that preserved this kind of white power and white privilege. So they had what they called fellows. And so in order for you to be appointed as a fellow, which allowed you to vote and to be on the executive board, your scholarship had to be assessed by people who were already fellows. And they had to decide whether or not it was like worthy and so on. So you had very few Black scholars who ended up being fellows. So imagine being a part of an organization where your vote and voice don't count, right? Because you're not invited into this group of fellows that are basically dominated by white men. And so from the beginning, the organization was set up that way. And things came to a head and changed in 1968 when a number of Black scholars decided that they had had enough, right? And they staged a protest, as they mentioned, at the ASA conference in Montreal. And people still talk about this, right? And the impacts of it, because they really tried to advocate for and put together like a whole platform about the need to include more Black scholars, more African scholars in this association that was dominated by white scholars who were literally excluding Black people from being a part of the leadership or even having a vote. And so when I think about Melville Herskovits' relationships to scholars, he helped to found this organization. He was a part of that original meeting that was called by the foundation that had all white scholars and also was involved in what it ended up looking like, right? So at the same time that you see him in some ways, again, his work was really important for these larger ideas about Blackness, but the way in which who he sought to support and the way in which he executed his kind of administrative stuff and everything else around the African Studies Association and so many other things shows that he was not an active advocate for Black people in that realm and in that way. So in that sense, you see him advocating for other white scholars coming in, other white scholars in terms of their grant proposals, other white scholars in terms of their involvement in ASA and so on, but not doing the same for Black scholars. And so that, I think, points to this larger conundrum. What do you do with this work that is so important for defining the study of Blackness and for getting us to think about cultural development, and that Black people themselves draw on this work so much, but realize that the person who created it was not really someone who wanted to see you thrive. and was not someone committed to Black liberation and equality necessarily in terms of how he operated. Sam?
Yeah.
Mhm.
I keep forgetting I'm on mute. Sherry Tolliver makes a comment in which she says there are some of the same issues now with the pushback on critical race theory and the fear/demonization of immigrants, et cetera. Yeah, I think you had covered that a little bit, and we're starting to see it. And being in museums, and I tell people all the time, whether you recognize it now or not, the pushback on critical race theory is going to hit museums as well. I was just in a meeting earlier today with the Association of African American Museums, and they're strategizing about how to position African American museums in a way that their work can grow and not be undermined with these pushbacks on anything talking about Black history, culture, which you cannot separate, my opinion, separate American racism or global racism from that discussion. And, so it's one of the things you just have to be conscious of and sort of prepare yourself to deal with. We've seen from one of the local schools here, people remember Swickley Academy, just totally getting rid of their diversity and inclusion team. And this did not necessarily come from the school, it came from parents who put pressure on the school board or the board there, and they got rid of the principal, and numerous teachers resigned and left, and so forth. And so these types of things are coming. It's another thing to be aware of as we try to continue to teach the African and the African American experience.
No, Sam, those are great points, and you're right. No one is safe. And it's what I see is kind of this larger cyclical thing happening. It's a cycle, right? It's like you take those 2 steps forward and you get that push back, right? And so it's, as we had so many advances with these larger social movements related to Black Lives Matter and other protests against police brutality and everything else, the murder of George Floyd and so many others, the conversations around race were opening in ways that they had never been. People were open to making a number of changes. Businesses were jumping on board, and then here we go. Sure, everything has to stop, and let's bring it back and push us back to the 50s here, right? You're right. We have to anticipate that these attacks are going to come for all of us. As a Department of Africana Studies, this is something I'm thinking about as well, because all it takes is a state legislature to start pushing something forward, and then we have to also fight with all of our might as well. And so I think establishing some connections and collaborations so that we can work together against this is going to be key. But we can't just stick our heads in the sand, because they're going to come as well for what we do, because it is transformational, the work that we do, not just for Black students, but for all students. And so that is what people are scared of. We're in a very similar kind of moment. People are scared of the demographic changes that are happening in this country, just as they were in the early 1900s, right? Where they were scared of this huge influx of immigrants. So the racial demographic changes happening in this country, the ethnic demographic changes are definitely something that are leading to and galvanizing this push back against diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Exactly. I think we've exhausted the questions in the chat and the Q&A. I do want to make a few announcements before we sign off. The From Slavery to Freedom film series will continue, in 2022, and we have a slate of 6 films beginning in February. That first film is called Blood Brothers, Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali. The theme for 2022 is going to be focused on the Black man. You'll get a lot more information as we move forward, possibly maybe in late December or January. The marketing materials will be out. So look for us on the History Center's Facebook page, on our webpage, Twitter, and all those other social media platforms for more information about the From Slavery to Freedom film series. Again, Yolanda, thank you so much for leading us into this discussion. I learned so much from you and watching the film. You know, if you haven't had a chance to read this book, please do read it, regardless of when it was published. It is a classic in Black studies, and getting the backstory is also important, and kind of help us understand how these things happen in academia and in other walks of life in terms of education in America. So with that, I'm going to say thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. Look out for more information for the 2022 film series, and have a good holiday, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, everyone. Take care.